Minister, on behalf of the City UK and Scottish Financial Enterprise, thank you for those fantastic comments and for your ambition and support for the industry. You spoke about the government's policy being practitioner-led. Please do look to us in this room as partners in that process. It now falls to me to introduce our first panel session of the day, and what a terrific panel session. We will be looking at going for growth in the regions and nations, the next steps for levelling up, building, I'm sure, on many of the points that have been raised in the speeches so far this morning. Please do welcome the chair of that panel to the stage, Sandy Begbie, my colleague and friend and counterpart over at SFE, together with his panel. Please do welcome them. Thank you.
Well, good morning, panel. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction and then we'll get started. So thank you, Miles. I think Andrew's session has given us a lot of input and material that we'll discuss over the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so. I think particularly one sentence he used in particular was this about expanding growth outside of London, which undoubtedly we'll pick up on. But we do have a great panel for you this morning. We've got Adrian Gillespie, the Chief Executive of Scottish Financial Enterprise, on the far left. We've got Jason Morris, who's sitting immediately next to me, who's the Regional Market Leader for Scotland, PwC. Emily Shepperd, who is the Chief Operating Officer and Director of Authorisations at the FCA. And then Martin Towns, Deputy Head of Global Real Estate at M&G. So I'm maybe just going to kick off just with quite an open question. I'm going to come to you first of all, Adrian, just as you pour your water. So but the last couple of months we've had a mini budget, we've had the Chancellor's statement, we've got a Scottish Government budget coming up, which, given your role, you'll be involved in. We've also got either in a recession or a recession is coming. We've got a lot of challenges. So and also got a new Prime Minister, of course. What does all that mean for levelling up? Is it dead? Is it alive? Is it working? Is it not working? How do you think about it?
Well, I guess for me, I think in the economy at the moment, we're in a situation where we've got clearly some challenging times for business, and part of our role is to support businesses through some of those challenges, particularly those who've got energy-intensive industries. But we've also got some fantastic opportunities, and we've heard some of that this morning. And the opportunity in Scotland around the net zero transition, where Scotland has positioned itself very clearly as a desire and steps to lead around that agenda. COP26 providing a brilliant platform last year. There's clearly a huge opportunity to capitalise on that. There are some challenges in achieving that successfully, and again, it's part of our role to work with the industry to attract capital to the country that will be an important part of that transition. But we're also seeing lots of companies, really exciting young companies growing up, who are very focused on net zero markets in areas like agri-tech, space applications, life sciences, fintech. And that makes me very, very positive about the future and about the potential to realise those 50,000 opportunities you talked about earlier, Sandy. And I think for me, levelling up, no matter, I suppose, how it's put forward in policy, is going to be really important to the future of the country if we're going to realise those ambitions. But actually, I think the net zero transition, in particular areas like offshore wind and hydrogen, play really well into the levelling up agenda. We have a lot of really important assets around the country which haven't been utilised well in recent years, ports, for example. And these can really have the potential to come alive again, create a lot of local jobs and be an important part of that transition. And also just the way that we're working now as well, I think opens up lots of opportunities for town centres, for regional locations to become part of, for example, the financial services industry. Perhaps town centres that had banks in the past and there's been a presence. I think there's an opportunity to establish that presence again through remote working. So I see a lot of potential for levelling up, but I think the critical point is that we're only going to be successful if we utilise all our skills and talents across the country. That's absolutely fundamental to success.
Great, thanks very much, Adrian. Jason, I'm going to come to you, and maybe specifically around the role of financial services, professional services in the levelling up agenda and the impact on communities. And of course, PwC just in the last 12 months have announced quite a bit of investment in expanding in Scotland, and I know that there's been a big drive in your firm to really strengthen your representation in all regions. So how do you think about levelling up from both from PwC, but actually how our sector should be thinking about our role?
So as you say, maybe through a PwC lens first, we clearly have clients the length and breadth of the country, so entirely appropriate. We've got offices across the UK, but we, over the last decade in particular, probably put a lot more thought into fundamentally a place-based approach. So where can certain regions and certain offices lead on our national agenda that plays to their local strengths, the local strengths around the community at large in terms of where they operate. So in the last few years, our Belfast office, which is now, we employ 3,000 people, our biggest office outside London, and we've made that investment around a technology background, a close collaboration with the universities, and they lead for us in certain aspects of our UK strategy. We've made investment in Cardiff, we've got a new office in Bradford, we announced 1,000 new jobs in Manchester, and again doing all of that, very much looking at what can the local region do to fulfil our national strategy. And in Scotland, clearly financial services, energy transition, and growing investment around ESG, those are areas where we really would like to make a difference on. And it's not just about headcount per se, but it's leadership. So we we have leaders in those aspects that sit in our regional offices and lead our UK dialogue. And that is very true, I think, of the industry at large. I think financial services and professional services has the benefit of not necessarily being, I suppose, a physical proximity environment sector. So retail or public services or whatever, you're very much reliant on proximity to where you sit. Here we have the ability to make investment in headcount in places that make sense, and you get a clustering benefit where you then collaborate with local communities. So it's very much the vision that we have at PwC, but I see that for the industry at large.
Okay, great. I'm going to come to you next, but I think I should have said at the beginning, we've got a poll question going on behind during the session, which I will refer to as we go through. So if you would like to vote, please go in through the app. Also, if you do have any questions, if you could submit them, then it'll be I'll be doing a mixture between questions here, but also I'll be picking up any questions from the floor. So encourage you to vote, and we'll pick some of that up later on. But Emily, how does the FCA view levelling up, and both from our point of view about the industry, obviously, that you support, but also the FCA itself?
So, I mean, Andrew just talked about £3.1 billion going to devolved nations, but one of the other things that Rishi's talked about is making the UK an island of innovation. So we do see ourselves as a strong role in that by being agile, by being flexible, by being innovative ourselves and supporting innovation. So as a regulator, as you're aware, I'm sure, we created the world's first sandbox for regulation, and we continue to invest in that. We hold a number of sprints, regular sprints on different topics and subjects. We've made that path from the sandbox across to authorisations easier by giving some sort of help, by giving some consultancy there. And then once a firm is authorised, particularly new firms, so a lot of innovation still comes from the bigger firms, but the new ones who are new to regulation, we have developed this, if you like, pathway for early and high growth oversight to help ease them in and to nudge them into the right sort of behaviours that we want to see. Within that, we only started in April. We've already got 13 Scottish-based companies in that environment. So yes,
apart from all that, there is the other sort of being located close to clients.
You know, so far this year, 75% of newly authorised firms are outside of London. So we have an office in Edinburgh where we have 200 staff. We have committed to double the path there. We also have an office in Leeds, very newly opened. We have representation in Wales and Cardiff and also in Northern Ireland.
Okay. I'll maybe come back to you later just about, because obviously, as Andrew said, you know, the scale of investment in fintech is quite interesting, and how does the regulator see that trajectory of travel and your response to that? But I'll maybe come back to you later on that specific point, because clearly it's a big agenda here in Scotland, given the scale of what we've got. But I'm going to come to Martin next. How do you see levelling up from your perspective? Obviously, given M&G's role and etc. So you'll have a particular angle around levelling up and the opportunities that may well come from it. So how would you respond to the direction of travel and levelling up?
Sure. So levelling up is obviously a hugely broad topic. And it also presents a range of opportunities for an investor such as ourselves. So we invest across asset classes, and typically we're a long-term, patient source of capital. And I don't think that for us investing, you know, in the regions across the UK is not a new thing. It's not driven by the levelling up agenda per se. It's something we've done for a long time with our capital, because we see opportunity to match that capital with a need and to generate an appropriate return. So I sit within our real estate investment business. So we manage around 20 billion in the UK. About 8 billion of that is outside of London and the South East. And if I look at our activities over the past few years, over the last 10 years, the end value of the regeneration and development projects that we've undertaken outside London and South East is around 1 billion. And obviously that's a significant investment, and it has a knock-on impact in those economies as well, which we try to measure in terms of, you know, jobs created directly and indirectly, but also the more sort of, you know, lasting impact on the place. I think a really good example of where we've done something like that is actually here in Edinburgh at Haymarket. So those of you who are based in Edinburgh, you might have seen the big hoarding near the train station. So that was a site which was derelict for about 4 decades, actually. It was old railway sidings. We believed that there was a demand in Edinburgh for new high-quality office space, for a new destination with leisure and with retail. And we invested around 250 million of our investors' capital in that opportunity. That's under construction at the moment. All of that space has been taken. It was largely taken pre-construction actually starting. So I think that, you know, that's an indication of the strength of the Edinburgh economy. But it was our conviction that we've delivered that type of space and make that investment, that we can also generate an attractive return for our investors by matching the capital to that market demand. The other point possibly to mention is ourselves as a business, as an employer. So we are based in London, that's the headquarters, but we have 2 offices in Scotland and we employ over 1,200 people. So I think that does talk to the rich history of financial services within Edinburgh that we heard about earlier in the introductory talks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Adrian, I'm going to come back to you. I'm actually going to refer to the poll here, because it picks up one of your themes, and it talks about the number one at the moment anyway, is driving forward green growth with a focus on technology infrastructure and green jobs. The phrase green jobs is used a lot these days, and also there's a lot of debate about whether or not what are these green jobs. Are they completely different to what they've been in the past? You rightly point out Scotland's got a lot of assets in this space. So how should we think about green jobs? What are they, and how does Scottish enterprise look at investment in order to achieve what are some pretty ambitious targets around green jobs for Scotland?
Yeah, well, I guess I touched on this earlier. They span a wide range of sectors. The financial services sector plays a really important part here. And in fact, you mentioned earlier green finance being a really important part and growing part of the financial services sector in Scotland, with a big focus from organisations like yours, Sandy, and from the Scottish Government. I mentioned space and space satellite applications. There are a lot of green jobs in that sector, fast growing applications, whether that's through environmental monitoring from space. Agritech, we have a company in Scotland, Intelligent Growth Solutions, who are a leading provider of vertical farming, and they're growing really fast all over the world at the moment. Just opened their first site in the USA a couple of weeks ago. But there's also maybe some more unusual areas. There's a company called Emergency One in Ayrshire, and I guess a part of Ayrshire which had some economic challenges in the past. They're growing really fast on the back of the provision of the world's first electric fire engine, which they're exporting around the world. So I just see more and more, and I suppose when it is absolutely pervasive, the job will be substantially done. But I think we're on a very strong trajectory now, where the fast-growing companies, the companies that are growing quickly, attracting investment and employing a lot of people, are increasingly targeted in areas that you could call green or net zero. Life sciences also, the life sciences industry plays a really important part in the net zero agenda. Chemical sciences, the decarbonisation of these large industries. So right across the piece, there's an awful lot of exciting things going on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'll just remind people, if you've got a question, if you'd like to submit it, please go ahead. I'm going to come back to you then on my point about, obviously, fintech in Scotland has been a real success for us. The report out last year, Fintech Scotland forecast thousands of new jobs in Scotland as a result of that. Even in the time I've been in post here, we almost doubled the number of fintech companies. And of course, we're now seeing it spread out of Edinburgh, Glasgow, but into other areas, Dundee, etc. So it's really having a strong ripple effect. How does regulation, and I think Andrew touched on this, about getting the balance between the regulator and innovation, and how do you see that? And he said, well, we will get the right balance. And I know over last night at dinner we were sitting next to each other and you were talking about crypto as an example. And how do you, Emily posed a great question at dinner last night, was how should we regulate crypto? I'm not sure we landed on the answer. But I think it just gives this idea of regulation and innovation. How do you see that balance that Andrew talked about?
So I think one of the things that Andrew did talk about as well was that need for partnership between the regulator and the businesses out there, hence asking the question, what do you think? So there are lots of different dynamics to it. One of them is around that talent. So for a regulator, for us, we need to get the right talent and a different competency set within the FCA. So that's something that we're absolutely looking at. When we chose Leeds as a new site, one of the reasons why we chose Leeds was because of the propensity of universities around there that produced data scientists. And we're seeing Leeds as a data science hub. Similarly in Edinburgh, Edinburgh University has the largest number of artificial intelligence people inside it, bigger than the whole of Europe. So we see that as a centre of excellence, and Abertay as well. Another place where we hope to get people who really understand fintech and understand crypto. So working together, that's why we have some of these sprints. Some of these sprints are pure technology sprints, but we've just started to introduce some policy sprints, where we sit down and we think about what is a new way of regulating, what is a new way of looking at this information. And us ourselves, we are changing the way that we are regulating by looking at data, all those regulatory returns that you have to send to us. We're looking at them all, seeing how we are using them. We're going to strip them back where we don't need the information, but there may be different information that we need. And we're looking at that information real time to look at patterns to see where we need to change, where problems may be occurring. But I think education generally is incredibly important. If you look at the cost of living challenge that we have now, one of the things that comes out of that is the need for better financial education.
Yeah. Definitely, and I think there was a comment made earlier, Andrew talked about 5 million young people not getting the financial education that they need. And I think that, I've not heard that figure before, it's deeply worrying and concerning. And so I'm going to come to you next, Jason. Obviously, PwC supported the Financial Services Skills Commission work, which we're heavily involved in as well. If there was one or two things that you would say that we need to change in the skills and education system, because I always hear these conversations about this is a great strength in Scotland, but actually there's also this, are we maybe being a bit complacent at times in terms of what we've got and what we've maybe not got? So what would, as a large employer, but also someone who is supporting other businesses, and that talent pipeline is so important, as Emily's called out in terms of education, what would you like to see change? Because we've got a lot of reviews going on at the moment in Scotland that would help that skills and education landscape.
Yeah, and I think vitally important. Clearly, I think the purpose as to what we are looking for our young people to be, I suppose, able, capable, to succeed in whatever their chosen profession is, and clearly vitally important. And it's quite clear that regularly in the room, and I'm sure we'll come back to it a number of times, skills and new skills and new jobs, that I think we all recognise that there's a lot of jobs in the future that we don't know what those are yet. I do think business has a vital role to play when we talk about things like clustering and specialisation in certain areas. Quite often, I think where we then need to go as business is to engage with higher education and all education to fundamentally create the talent pipelines that will come through to fulfil the jobs that we need, whether that's on the green agenda, where there's a massive, clearly new skills opportunity, or whether it is, as we've called out a couple of times, in basic financial skills. I think it's one of the things that probably what worries us most in the room is the ability of the next generation to make, I suppose, better or informed financial decisions and be engaged in the importance of those decisions and their ability to use those decisions to effectively influence things around investment. So one of the conversations, again, that we touched on last night at dinner was that idea that, taking charge of your pension and using it to invest in those areas that might meet your own personal desires, effectively. And the challenge there was how well, what is the financial literacy, effectively, of people to make those decisions, and in general, their engagement around, even broad things like pensions. So I think it's, I do think business has a really important role. I think we can see in business where the opportunities are, and I think we've got a really important job to push that down as well as we can through the education system.
Okay, great, thank you. I've got a couple of questions that have been submitted. So I'm going to maybe come to yourself, Martin, for one of the questions, which is about, there's obviously a lot of big projects in the UK at the moment. There's a lot of money getting invested. You've got, obviously, HS2, you've got Sizewell, you've got the East West Rail. So there's a lot of levelling up type projects that are being invested in. We're going to have an announcement of two green free ports here in Scotland imminently. And so therefore, what role can those projects play in levelling up? And is there more that we should be doing? For example, a question here was, why isn't HS2, for example, coming all the way to Scotland? Would it not be a good way of thinking about levelling up to think about those investments across the entire country?
Yeah, I think the question about significant infrastructure projects is really important because, they don't just generate, perhaps direct benefits in themselves, but obviously they can have a significant knock-on impact when it comes to investors like ourselves thinking about where do we then want to invest, because those infrastructure projects can clearly be a significant catalyst for change. I mean, if you took a London example, which we perhaps shouldn't do on this panel, but if we did, and we looked at Crossrail, you know, you saw significant investment in parts of London where you wouldn't have seen it before because you had that transport connectivity. So I do think that there's sort of a more holistic consideration that should be given to those types of projects, and perhaps a greater attempt to kind of measure the holistic benefits that they're likely to bring, including acting as a catalyst for other investors to come in. I think, you know, obviously, you know, perhaps we're talking about levelling up, and we're talking about those infrastructure projects acting as potentially a catalyst to aid further investments for levelling up. But, you know, what else do we get involved in where, you know, there isn't sort of the market conditions to support, you know, investment in the ordinary course? So what we do a lot of the time is working in partnership with other stakeholders, including with local authorities. So when we can take that sort of long-term patient investment approach, if we have stakeholders who are well organised and they are prepared to make a commitment to those projects as well, that can be something which can unlock capital. So a good example would be an investment that we made in Rochdale Town Centre. And I think if you sat, you know, most property investors down and said, you know, give me your top 10 places you'd like to invest capital, perhaps Rochdale wouldn't have been in that list. But we worked in partnership with the local authority there to regenerate their city centre. And they made a commitment to it, we made a commitment to it. And it's increased footfall in the city centre by around 100%. And it's created about 22 million of GVA per annum for that area. So I think that the use of infrastructure as a catalyst can be important, but I think also there's opportunities for the private sector and the public sector stakeholders to work in partnership to unlock that investment which wouldn't otherwise come.
I think, Adrian, I'll come to you saying just one additional point on that. I think that's something that we find ourselves getting involved in a lot of conversations about how do you unlock the capital and get the capital flow going from where the money is into the need. And I think both that partnership, but also how do you create investable projects, I think is another thing that we hear quite frequently. But Adrian.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to. I think that's a really important point, and I was just going to make the point that the financial business services sector plays a really important part in the Levelling Up agenda, but it has done for some time now. And I was looking at Glasgow and what's happened in Glasgow over the last 20 years or so, where a real focused effort, such as you described there, public-private partnership, developed the International Financial Services District in Glasgow, attracted some major international names, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, for example. And that community has grown up. The infrastructure investment was absolutely critical to making that happen. And then most recently, the attraction of the Barclays campus. And that has completely regenerated that whole area and provided really well-paid jobs. And I see a similar thing happening now with potential in Dundee, which has had a huge amount of infrastructure investment as well. Lloyds Banking Group acquired Embark Group, and we've worked very closely to develop a support proposition and skills proposition, and are having a very good experience there. So I would think Dundee's now on the map for these kinds of big financial services and other investments, and that can play a really critical role in that city's future as well.
And just, I'm going to pick up a question here because what your answer, there's a bit of a theme here, which I'm just going to stick with you, Adrian, at the moment. There's a comment about a number of financial service firms across the UK have offshored a number of jobs in the last 14, 15 years. As you rightly point out, some great investments in Glasgow, Dundee, Edinburgh, etc. You know, really positive. But should we be doing more to encourage or incentivise firms to bring those jobs back onshore?
Well, look, we're always looking for additional investment. We've got a very important and successful track record of inward investment here. It's a really important part of our economy, and financial services would be an important part of that. We've got the best track record of inward investment outside London consistently now for the last 9 years. So I think we've got a very, very strong proposition. But also we have a very values-based inward investment approach as well. So we're looking to attract the right kinds of jobs to the country alongside the right kinds of industrial partners. So yes, I think where there's a strong fit there, Sandy, between that values-led approach and the jobs that we're wanting to attract here, we can do that. And I think that's not just for financial services as well. We talked about advanced manufacturing as being an important sector. I think there's potential to attract more jobs back to the UK on the back of technological advancements. But I suppose the way that we're working now, and I mentioned earlier the potential, maybe latent potential across the country of skills that haven't been maybe accessible to city centres in the past, would make some more of that investment feasible and attractive.
Okay, good. And Emily, on a slightly similar theme in some respects, which is, it's great that FCA have invested in Leeds and Edinburgh and etc. But one of the questions is still a lot of the power concentrated, quite centralised, continues in London. Is a sort of decentralised approach in terms of responsibilities, more responsibility given to those regions? Is that part of levelling up in the FCA? Is there a need to sort of pass more out to the regions and become a bit more regionalised in how it thinks about how it operates?
Honestly, I think with a hybrid working model, that decentralisation has sort of happened naturally. But we do have a specific devolved nation team that's based up here in Edinburgh, and they work closely with I think many people here already to really understand the needs that are specific to that community. And we're developing, again, part of that devolved nations team. We have one person in Cardiff, one person in Northern Ireland at the moment, but I'm sure that will grow over time. So absolutely yes, and I think it's important for our supervisors to be close to the firms that they're supervising, to really understand what that environment is like. So I think it's happening naturally, but we do have a specific team focused on it too.
Okay. So we've got. I'm sort of going to wrap up with quite a broad question, and I'm going to give it to all four of you. And because you've all got great experience from your own lens, you will interact with lots of different countries and internationally. And one of the questions here is about what should we be comparing ourselves against? What country does this really well? What country has really driven a levelling up agenda where actually there is real spread of opportunity, growth across the respective countries? Is there anywhere that you would hold up and say that's somewhere that we could really learn from in this regard? So I can see them all thinking. Jason's going to come first, but Jason, just because you're on my immediate left, I'm going to.
Thanks, Andy.
Good thing is if you get your country out, then they can't repeat it. So.
It's. I must admit, I'm not sure that I can think of one country who necessarily gets this right, because it is a challenge. Most of you, if we look at kind of geographies, quite often, most of a capital city, and quite often that is the centre, I suppose, of a lot of the activity. So I feel that if I do hold up some of the things that we're doing in the UK, I think one of the areas that so I'm not really answering your question, Sandy, but I'll answer it in a slightly different way. I think one of the things we have developed and are doing very well in the UK is looking at levelling up in a much broader sense. We've spoken quite a lot today about infrastructure and connectivity, but looking at levelling up through an agenda that is much broader. And what does growth mean for people in the regions and that they sit in? And it's much broader than just jobs. It's health. It's access to new opportunities. It's safety. It's the high streets, etc. And I know in the latest kind of government white paper, it is very bold in its desire to also consider other inequalities, gender, race, some of those aspects that probably were most exposed through the last pandemic. So I think we have a really well-directed ambition and aims around levelling up in the UK, but I've not directly giving you an answer. I'm hoping in the time that I've responded in a kind of slightly broader way that my three colleagues might have one.
We had a little laugh beforehand saying I was going to be more Jeremy Paxson and I said to Jason, if you don't answer a question, I'm going to come back and you've not answered my question. But I'm going to let you away with that
Thank
one.
you.
So I'm going to, Martin, I'm going to come to you next and just how do you think about this comparison and anything we should be learning from elsewhere?
It's a good question. So I do spend a fair bit of time in other countries and talking to investors from around the world. And obviously as a real estate investor as well, we spend time looking at where should we be investing in different countries. I think possibly, two things to say. I think some countries who've done very well in sort of creating wealth through financial services sector have clearly had a long-term focus on that. And it's been quite carefully planned and perhaps planned quite holistically. But I think it's quite dangerous for us to say that X country has developed in a certain way or leveled up in a certain way, and that is therefore the model we should pursue, because there's always going to be underlying differences and a different starting point. I think one of the things which can be considered and links directly to levelling up is obviously thinking about the public functions or public bodies and where they are located within the country. And obviously that's something we're seeing in the UK already, with certain functions or organisations moving more out of London into other parts of the country. I think that does create a direct benefit and can in itself act as a catalyst. But again, I'd go back to saying that I think it's perhaps a little bit difficult for us to say, there is another country, that's the way they've done it, that's the example. I think there's probably maybe elements of best practice that we could take from that. But I think the reality is that we'll need to find our own path to delivering those outcomes.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Emily, I'll come to you next, and I'll come to...
Thank you, Sandy. So, yes, big, broad question. So I'm going to do the only thing I can, which is narrow it. I'll narrow it to regulators, and then I'm going to narrow it further to innovation to try and find some sort of answer. I'd say that the Singapore regulator a few weeks ago held a massive event on innovation in Singapore, and there were people coming from all over the world to that event. We had focus on ESG, there was other focus as well on fintech more generally. And they were offering £1 million investment prizes to firms at that event. That's a regulator investing. I'd love to be able to do that. We don't have that model here, but it's something that, sometimes thinking outside the box can create better results. So there you are. That's my pitch.
Yeah, and Singapore is often held up as an example in many different ways. But so, Adrian, I know you have travelled the world a lot. You're just particularly in your current role, you get a real close insight into other economies, etc. So, any final thoughts from yourself on this?
So I agree. I don't think it's just one location. I think there's best practice we can take from a number of locations, and we keep a close eye on that. And Singapore would be an area that we look at in terms of their approach to developing high technology areas. Denmark as well, big focus on high productivity. The really strong SME manufacturing base in Germany, for example. Finland and their very internationally facing approach and their attraction of high technology companies. Ireland's approach to inward investment as well have been very successful in taking forward their economy. But I actually do think there's some really good examples of it in Scotland as well. I think the growth of innovation districts has been something that has been really interesting to see. Has also been on the back of looking at areas like Barcelona, who have done this really well. But how can you actually take the best of Scotland's really strong academic and research capability and translate that into growth companies and well-paid, high productive jobs across the economy? Yesterday I attended the launch of the Medicines Manufacturing Innovation Centre. That's one of the first of two major hubs in a new advanced manufacturing innovation district that's growing up to the west of Glasgow. And that's doing exactly that. It's taking really top-class international research from across universities in the UK, University of Strathclyde leading it, but that's creating lots of opportunities for companies and for the supply chain. Next to that, new National Manufacturing Institute Scotland will open next year, £75 million investment, doing the same thing. And I think you can see a real strong case now for attracting international investment into advanced manufacturing in Scotland. We've got a lot to talk about that we didn't have a few years ago. So I think that's a really good example of internationally influenced approaches to levelling up.
That's great. Listen, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Jason, Emily, Martin and Adrian for your time this morning. We've overrun by 5 minutes or so, but I thought the conversation was going really well. I wanted to particularly get that last question in for everyone. So that concludes our first panel session. It's now time for our break. We will ask you still to be back here for 11:50, so we'll get ourselves back on track. But I would just like to ask you to show your appreciation to our panel. Thank you very much.